Okay, so now that we're learning about what HetCisNorms are, the question is why? Why is this important? Why do we need to be thinking about HetCisNorms? So the first part that I want to talk about is how HetCisNorms are the reason that we're told as practitioners that we should value affirming our LGBTQ youth. And while it makes sense, like we should affirm anyways, affirming is where we value individuals for who they are just as they are, and we accept that this is who people are. But when we have het cis norms, what affirming does is it becomes reactionary. We become reactive by having to affirm because of all the harm and the the hardship that comes to LGBTQ youth and the LGBT community. So affirming practice functions as a reactive band-aid to address disaffirming discourse without moving to challenge norms that perpetuate the need to affirm. So, for instance, the APA, American Psychological Association, values affirming practice as we should. And what they share in their ethics and commentary on providing services with LGBT community members is they say they recommend taking an affirming stance towards sexual minority persons in all aspects of planning, conducting, disseminating, and applying research with aims of reducing health disparities, promoting health and well-being, and using affirming strategies to actively resist against the tendency of het cis norms to exert undue discriminatory practices toward LGBTQ youth. So this is important content that APA, the American Psychological Association, validates and values in practice. Okay, so the second part, instead of having to be reactive, as we were saying on the last page, by using affirming practice to combat harmful messages, what if instead we focus on het cis norms as the source of macro level narratives that are telling us who's valued and who's not, challenged these attitudes or bias to eliminate the need to affirm as a reactive intent, and instead replaced our existing macro norms with ideals that don't view LGBTQ people or identity as an other, but as normal, as acceptable, as authentic selves that are just as worthy of access, of love, of acceptance as the next person. Okay, so now that we've talked about why are we conceptualizing het cis norms? Because it's a possible agent that we can make change the more and more we come to realize how they function in our society. But in order to learn how they function, we have to learn how they develop so we can then get to the root of what's going on. Okay, so how do het cis norms function and develop? Through social construction. So what is social construction? Social construction is how we develop meaning or connotation of objects, events, constructs, or ideas as a society, and how we adopt these meanings as factual attitude. So when we read stories, for instance, and we're told that the prince and princess end up together, we begin to think to ourselves at a young age, wow, that's such a nice ending. I want that ending. This ending happens over and over. So I'm going to keep listening to this, and this is going to be what I believe to be true. So that's social construction. It's how we narrate and passively or actively teach ourselves what we're going to assume as fact and real in our world, when in fact, it's not fact or real at all. It's a constructed narrative and story. So we uphold social construction through ecological norms that in and of itself uphold systems of power that comes from our upbringing experiences of things we've consciously and unconsciously turned into automatic thoughts. So then we've been talking about these like automatic thoughts, bias. So what are these? These are parts of an attitude. So an attitude is developed through social construction, and it includes evaluative ideas and judgments or cognitions that are accompanied by feelings and behavioral responses. So an attitude is a complete entity that includes a cognitive, behavioral, and affective component. So attitudes often carry a negative connotation and put people on the defensive when working with multicultural, diverse populations. So when working with these communities and with diverse individuals, we need to really call into question our views, our preconceived notions, and the inherent bias and the unearned privilege that we are exerting at a table. So it's important to be able to bring these to our consciousness and our forefront as much as possible so we can actively seek to challenge and have awareness that this exists. So when we think of attitudes, a common word we may hear is bias. So bias is a brain shortcut, also known as a heuristic, that resembles a prejudicial attitude in favor or against a thing, person, or group compared with another, in ways that usually evoke feelings of unfairness. So bias itself forms as a schema to help our brains make quick judgments that prevent us from objectively evaluating all incoming data of an individual situation. So with bias, we're prejudging situations before we get into them because we have socially loaded ideas before we get into a situation. For instance, if I'm going to give a speech in a large room, I might be more nervous than in a small room because my brain has formed the attitude that large rooms are going to have large questions and small rooms are going to be more intimate conversations. So I'm making an evaluation before I get to a table. That's the same thing when we're thinking of HetCisNorms. This is why we see more het cis white men in higher positions, and why we actively seek to undo our biases to have a more diverse representation of colleagues, of people in our lives, and diversifying our field as we call for equity, diversity, inclusion efforts. So this is how attitudes as a bias may impact our lives in day-to-day situations. So where biases can be implicit or explicit, what this refers to is explicit bias or conscious bias is when we are very clear about how we feel, when we know our attitudes, when it's easy for us to make sense of things. And so we may do things intentionally because our worldview may lead us to favor doing certain things, but not others. But we also may be doing things, even though we're aware of it, without even knowing, because yes, we're aware that we may hold bias, but we might not be aware of how this is impacting our day-to-day and social interactions, which this is referred to as implicit, unconscious, inherent bias. So this bias comes from the outside of one's awareness, and it may contradict what we say out loud our beliefs are because we don't know that these are beliefs that we implicitly hold. So implicit bias is unconscious and automatically seeps into our affect and our behavior. And the only way that we can really intervene with this is to sit and consciously reflect and take things like the IAT, the implicit apperception test, through Harvard University, and it tells you what your biases tend to favor and can bring our awareness to how we're actually feeling. So these are just some ideas around bias and why these systems of power, even when we say we're doing our best to promote equity, we may implicitly still be contributing to the problem until we can sit back, relax, and really dissect and take conscious action and make conscious choices of how we can do better. So when we think of confirmation bias, this is an example of if we believe something, whether it's implicit or explicit, we seek information that validates and verifies what we believe we know to be true. So for instance, if someone feels queasy about HetCisNorms and or feels queasy that ooh, I feel comfortable with HetCisNorms and valuing cisgender heterosexual identities and people around me, but I'm going to avoid people with other sexual orientations and genders and avoid conversations about it because it just makes me feel uncomfortable, then we're going to be investing more time and we're going to implicitly just value and lean toward conversations that view HetCisNorms as the norm. So this is a confirmation bias. We look to put ourselves in situations that are comfortable, that align with our attitudes and views. And so the only way we can get around confirmation bias is when we actively seek to challenge it, put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, or tell ourselves that our current beliefs are wrong and we need to take steps to look into how to resolve and work through them. All right, so that's it for this part of the PowerPoint. Thank you.